Hello and salutations once again. Welcome back to the Philos-Hippie podcast, in which we explore the intersection of philosophy and spirituality and how they can both help us live more holistic, meaningful, secular lives, which still has respect for the soul. Now, if it has not been made abundantly clear by now by the name of my YouTube channel and my overall appearance in general, I like to call myself a bit of a hippie. I've always been a tree hugging psychonaut that just wants to spread peace, love, and wisdom to the world. However, I am not a New Ager, and I dislike a lot of central aspects to it, which I will eventually dive into another video someday in greater depth. But in short, I feel that a lot of New Agers do not have solid philosophical ground upon which they can stand in their values and their beliefs. Some hippies and New Agers can be way too wishy-washy in their beliefs and attitudes, and I find that to be a massive problem within the spiritual community today. That is part of the goal of this podcast here, to try and bring a sense of coherency and stability to people's spiritual beliefs and the way in which they engage in the world without falling for so many of the traps that loosey-goosey New Ageism or fundamentalist traditionalist religions lay before us. This podcast is all about trying to find the middle way, like the Buddha often talked about, without resorting to extremes on either side of perspective. With all that being said, today's topic will be on panpsychism, and it will initially sound like it is all a bunch of hippie bullshit, but I will try and bring in the ideas of the top philosophers on the infamous, notorious, mysterious concept that we call consciousness, and all which it entails. Now, I deeply implore you to keep your skeptical goggles on as we dive into this elusive topic. And if you feel it, please call me out if what I'm saying doesn't track with you, or if you take issue with any of the material I present today, or if you just have any criticisms in general, because I am open to any and all ideas like that. Now, with all that being said, let's enter deeper into the mind bending reality in which we get to live in. So, to begin today's discussion, I want to tell a bit of a personal story. This summer, I had the most amazing opportunity to travel to Peru, deep into the sacred mountains of the Sacred Valley, and partake in a life altering ayahuasca ceremony. I was lucky enough to be guided by an indigenous shaman deeply steeped within the tradition of Amazonian plant medicine. Now, I've taken psychedelics before, mostly for therapeutic purposes like helping my depression and anxiety, which has helped immensely in my life. But this experience, on the other hand, was therapeutic for my entire soul and being, not just my behavior. After purging my guts out, after drinking the medicine, the power of ayahuasca began to take hold and the world around me began to dissolve, but also simultaneously deeply alive and vibrant. The stars above me felt so close to me that I could reach out with my hands and just touch it. The stars were twinkling rainbows in my eyes as lines appeared to connect all the dots like a map of constellations. The moon's light felt super radiant as much so as the sun, and I thought I could see its almost ephemeral soul shaping itself into new and elusive forms. The night sky above and the roaring bonfire below was so breathtaking, so awe-inspiring that I was smiling ceaselessly in complete gaze and in complete awe and wonder. However, instead of going on an intense kaleidoscopic vision quest, my journey led me deep into the crevices of my mind and was much more contemplative and emotional in nature. It wasn't like I received any groundbreaking insights into the nature of reality, only revealed to me like some messiah or prophet. Rather, the insights I gained confirmed for me through direct experience the philosophical attitudes and beliefs I already leaned in favor of but gave further evidence for. For instance, one of the most pressing insights that came to my forefront was how utterly absurd the mind body split was. Now, for a quick refresher, the mind body split is the idea that mind and body are fundamentally separate from one another, that the material and mental aspects of reality are fundamentally disconnected, which the philosopher Rene Descartes proposed at the start of the 16th century, which actually kickstarted our entire modern era. But under the plant medicine, I kept on repeating to myself that body and mind are one, that my body isn't carrying my soul, but rather my body is my soul, and my soul is my body, that there is no distinction between the two, and that they are fundamentally interlinked. And I almost began to laugh uncontrollably at the silliness of this categorical distinction we made because it just felt so wildly distant from the direct truth of my experience. The reason why it felt like my body and mind were one was because I simultaneously felt at one with the universe, source, gestalt, God, ground of being, whatever name you want to call the fundamental layer of reality. I felt as if my ego died and reunited and fully merged into the infinite and eternal field of consciousness, that primal archetypal realm of all being with a capital B. It made me realize that this was maybe God, the reality of all existence, not some ancient sky daddy. If God is the archetypal form of the true, the good, and the beautiful, according to Plato, that must mean existence, beingness, aliveness, consciousness is the most true, good, and beautiful aspect of reality and nature. And if Genesis is correct in saying that all are created in the image of God, then this must imply that humanity's image reflects that of existence and being at its fundamental essence. This all made me realize how crucial consciousness is to the integrity and stability of existence. The only thing that remained for me during my ego trip, and also for thousands of monks, mystics, and psychonauts around the world, was my conscious awareness, in which I was but a simple observer of my thoughts, while still remaining in control of my mental faculties. This made me internalize the fact that all is mind, that all the universe is a manifestation of intellect, nous, mind, soul, psyche, or whatever pretentious philosophical term you want to use. This was the moment when I realized deep down that panpsychism is true, down to the depths of my being, that everything in the universe has consciousness to some degree. This had profound implications for my spiritual life, which I will dive into later, but after realizing this through direct experience, I sought to understand panpsychism in greater philosophical depth, and to make sure that all of this wasn't just some crazy drug that was infecting my mind with narcissistic delusions or anything like that. I set out to determine whether or not this experience was a simple hallucination, but rather a deeper glimpse into the nature of reality. Now, this is where panpsychism comes in, and the work of the extraordinary contemporary Irish philosopher Philip Goff, who has been an immense inspiration to me as of late in researching this subject. Now, it's good to understand how we actually define consciousness before we dive deeper. And now just know that there's a whole debate in and of itself with regards to how we actually define consciousness. But I like Annika Harris's simplified definition in her brilliant audio documentary Lights On. And she says that consciousness is simply felt experience, or it could also be the subjective experience of what it is like to be a certain thing. Quoting Philip Goff from his great book Galileo's Error, panpsychists believe that consciousness is a fundamental and ubiquitous feature of the physical world. Now, when you break down the word panpsychism to its Greek roots, pan means all or everything, and the word psyche means mind or soul. This does not mean, however, that your toilet is having an existential crisis and is experiencing suffering whenever you piss or shit into it. Goff makes clear that panpsychists do not actually believe that literally every single thing is conscious. In his words, to quote him, they believe that the fundamental constituents of the physical world are conscious, but they need not believe that every random arrangement of conscious particles results in something that is conscious in its own right. End quote. Goff later goes on to say that consciousness found within human minds are not found everywhere in the universe. Our brains are one of the most complex evolutionary processes that we know exists, and so it would make sense that it is imbued with some form of consciousness. But for something as simple as a rock or a microscopic amoeba, the capacity for consciousness is weakened, although not altogether eliminated in Goff's view. To quote him again, it is also possible that the light of consciousness never switches off entirely, but rather fades as organic complexity reduces. This fading, while never turning off continuum, further extends into inorganic matter with fundamental physical entities. Perhaps electrons and quarks, but they possess extremely rudimentary forms of consciousness to reflect their simple nature. End quote. So, all the way down to the base particles of matter, there is some experience that electrons and protons and neutrons are feeling when they are bumping around in the eternal void. But why would anyone actually believe in this hippie, new age, woo woo nonsense? Well, simply because it isn't. Panpsychism used to be a scoffed upon position before the 21st century, but it has been gaining a lot of traction in recent years, despite it still being a minority position. This is due to a few factors, such as neuroscientists' quests to find the neural correlates of consciousness, or in other words, the specific brain processes that give rise to conscious felt experience. Unfortunately, this quest has failed because it has left many materialists left in the dark with a plethora of questions left unsolved. But also, in recent years, philosophers like David Chalmers, Galen Strawson, Annika Harris, and Philip Goff, and Christoph Koch have all been aiming their academic attention and their resources devoted to answering where exactly consciousness comes from. Where does it arise actually? This has been due to resurgence of interest in older philosophers like Thales, William James, Alfred North Whitehead, Benedict Spinoza, and Bertrand Russell. And this is all due to less cultural taboo around the subject in general now. Ultimately, these philosophers have recognized the limits of our materialistic scientific worldview and how they have essentially held us back from analyzing subjective experience in its full capacity. This is due to the fact that science simply wasn't designed to measure subjective experience in a quantitative way. Because of one of the leading fathers of modern science, Galileo Galilei. In Goff's book, Galileo's Error, he explains how Galileo heralded great advancements in the scientific method by emphasizing the crucial role that empirical observation and experimentation needs to play in learning about reality and nature. Galileo sought to separate mathematics from religion and theology, while describing the natural phenomena of the world. Galileo established the laws of nature by utilizing quantitative measurements of the physical world. Galileo is the one that cemented mathematics as the language of science, and in so doing, he purposefully left consciousness out of that equation because he kind of had to. In order to accurately describe nature mathematically, Galileo had to forego the prominent trend of, of prior philosophers who thought that sensory qualities were an innate feature of the physical world. Sensory qualities, in this sense, are simply things like sounds, emotions, tastes, colors, and so on. However, one can now write an algebraic equation as to what love feels like, or what a rainbow looks like to a blind person. Galileo knew that mathematics cannot accurately describe sensory qualities, and so he separated sensory qualities from physical properties of matter. So, for example, talkies aren't actually spicy, love isn't actually real, rainbows don't actually have color in it. It is simply that our brain filters the world in these subjective sensory ways through a massive filter. Through Galileo's re envisionment of the material world, matter then became to have only four main characteristics: size, shape, location, and motion. Galileo then said that all these sensory qualities we experience are all derived from the soul, our conscious experience. To quote Goff again, by stripping the world of its sensory qualities, color, smell, taste, sound, etc., and having only the minimal characteristics of size, shape, location, and motion, Galileo had, for the first time in history, created a material world which could be entirely described in mathematical language. He transformed the sensory qualities from features of things in the world, such as yellow lemons, for example, into forms of consciousness in the souls of human beings. This was the birth of mathematics. However, Galileo recognized that this new scientific worldview was fundamentally limited in its scope of reality. Philip Goff often jokes that if Galileo traveled to the future and saw how hard a time materialists and dualists are having in explaining consciousness through physical properties, he would say, "Of course you are. I designed physical science to deal with quantities, not qualities." Just because of the fact that science and technology has made impressive breakthroughs when we began to describe nature in strictly mathematical terms, it doesn't mean that it won't do the same when we turn our attention from quantities to qualities and combine them together. We have just simply ignored this aspect of reality altogether and have not devoted the time and effort to actually trying to incorporate a worldview that includes both quantities and qualities and synthesizes them into a larger perspective. To quote Goff once again, Galileo's error was to commit us to a theory of nature which entailed that consciousness was essentially and inevitably mysterious. In other words, Galileo created the problem of consciousness. This has led us to three positions of how consciousness interacts with material reality. The first is the materialist camp, which simply denies that consciousness and subjective experience even exist and is only an illusion. The next camp is the dualist, which was from Rene Descartes. And they argue that mind and body are radically separate things and that the two of them can never intertwine with each other. And then there is the panpsychist tribe, the minority tribe, which believes that consciousness is indeed a part of the physical world, which is able to intersect objective and subjective features of reality in a harmonious manner. However, the panpsychists truly understand that in order to solve a problem, you have to have an understanding of what the problem actually is, and that science must make it its aim to include consciousness in its studies and in its domain if it ever wants to truly solve its nature into getting a deeper comprehension of reality. Because currently, right now, the physical sciences are not designed in order to actually provide explanations for the intrinsic nature of reality. The physical sciences are influenced, whether knowingly or not, by the philosophical view of causal structuralism, wherein the essence of physical properties are identified with their causal roles or functions. Physical properties like matter and mass do not have their own identifiable definition, which differentiates them from each other. Both matter and mass, both matter and mass use each other's words in their definition of the other and do not actually reveal the intrinsic nature of their properties. This is what is known as the circularity objection against causal structuralism, and this leads us down a never ending staircase to ambiguity and uncertainty. Goff says that, quote, physics tells us not what matter is, but only what it does, end quote. This is because physics is merely a predictive tool for the laws of nature, which is useful in its own right, but it fails in its endeavor to seek out any actual explanation as to what those laws of nature actually are. If physics' fundamental task is to describe a cohesive and unifying theory of reality, then we must be able to give a, quote, non-circular, non-circular characterization of the properties postulated by our theory. Thus, if causal structuralism is true, in order to know the nature of a physical property, we need to know what the property does, and not merely its place in an abstract pattern of causal relationships, end quote, according to Goff. Now, none of this is a criticism of physics itself, but it's rather trying to shine a light in the direction physics must go if it wants a deeper understanding of reality. Currently, physics has two main problems it is required to face head on. The first is the problem of consciousness, in which we ask ourselves how we integrate consciousness into a scientific story of the universe that fits in. The second is the problem of intrinsic natures, wherein physics tells us nothing about the intrinsic nature of matter and lacks in explanatory properties. A prevailing theory in the panpsychist community comes from the biggest brains of the 20th century, philosopher, laureate, and megachad Bertrand Russell, and also the physicist Arthur Eddington, the one that proved Einstein's theory of general relativity by observing the bending of starlight from a solar eclipse nearly more than a century ago. These two sought to answer these problems by describing consciousness as the intrinsic nature of all matter, thereby killing two birds with one stone. Now, this is a plausible possibility simply due to the fact that there seems to be no better alternative offered by materialists and dualists right now to solve these two problems. And it also abides by Occam's razor, which is the philosophical idea that the simplest answer is typically the best one. Now, this all sounds fine and dandy, but if consciousness is the intrinsic nature of matter, how will we go about measuring this with empirical data and measuring this in the real world? How would scientists actually exactly go about attempting to describe physical reality in relation to consciousness? One of the most prominent theories in recent years is that of the integrated information theory, which was recently pioneered by the neuroscientist Giulio Tononi. Now, I can't put it into any better words myself, so here's another long quote by Philip Goff. Almost any physical system is associated with some degree of integrated information, even a single molecule. The presence of integrated information does not in itself indicate the presence of consciousness, according to integrated information theory, or IIT for short. The theory tells us that in any physical system, consciousness is present at the level at which there is the most integrated information. For example, a molecule contained within the brain would not be conscious, as the level of integrated information in the brain is much higher than the level of integrated information in a solid single molecule. However, integrated information theory predicts that a molecule in a puddle of water will be conscious, as there is more integrated information in the molecule than in the puddle as a whole. This is a theory of consciousness with considerable empirical support, and yet it entails that consciousness is much more widespread and pervasive than we ordinarily assume. End quote. At its core, consciousness scales with maximum integration, not necessarily with size. So, that is why brains, whether human or not, are always endowed with consciousness with lived felt experience because of the massive amount of processing and integration brains require to properly function. And if brains are made up of matter, neurons, and particles, then that must mean that there are levels of proto consciousness down to its base level, which eventually add up when they combine and integrate into each other. We can measure consciousness by analyzing where information is integrated into its maximum capacity within any given physical system. Now, you may now be asking yourself how consciousness appears in our minds as we know it if everything has some degree of consciousness down to the smallest particles. Like, how does that actually work? How do small conscious things like atoms and molecules create big conscious things like brains, for example? Now we know that rocks and sediments create mountains, but how does matter that is not aware in and of itself create consciousness on the large scale? This is what is known as the combination problem. And it's probably the biggest critique of panpsychism today, and unfortunately, it is yet to be solved. However, not yet. However, the panpsychists have a slight edge over the materialists in this regard because they have a smaller conceptual gap to fill in their philosophical problems. The materialist must somehow bridge subjective experience with objective quantities, which has so far proved unsuccessful, most notably in the attempt to find the neural correlates of consciousness within the brain, as I talked about earlier. Whereas the panpsychist must simply account for how subjective qualities can simultaneously exist at the micro and macro levels, which we know exist in human and animal brains. And we already see promising developments in this area with with regard to the integrated information theory, as I just discussed previously. It just needs more empirical research done to fully confirm its ideas, and I think in the future we'll get much more data on this subject in general. Now, I've just attempted to provide a very rough and very brief defense of panpsychism from the philosophical perspective. But if panpsychism is taken to be true, does it have the potential to directly impact our lives? I think the answer to that question is a resounding yes. Now, when I first began reflecting on panpsychism, the idea that consciousness is not confined to human minds but is woven into the very fabric of reality, I thought of it as a modern, even radical view. But the more I studied, the more I realized that many spiritual traditions have already been living with this intuition for thousands of years now. Panpsychism resonates deeply within many Eastern traditions, for it fundamentally sees consciousness as interconnected with all reality. This immediately eliminates the false illusion that you, your ego, the infamous I, are separate from the world around you. It removes the black and white binary between self and other, and fosters a more inclusive and compassionate perspective of the world. This is fundamentally what my ayahuasca experience showed to me during the summer. It showed me a glimpse into the deeper nature of reality, where my sense of self melted into the conscious field of the cosmos. My mind, body, and soul were all one unifying presence, merged into the fabric of reality. But don't take my word for it. The Taoists said that qi, which is the circulating vital life force for all existence, flows through all inanimate or animate things through the Tao, which is that which cannot be named, but is the ineffable source of all reality. The Taoists described qi as having an inner vitality. It was not simply a mechanical and biological force. This idea of chi and life force energy was actually the inspiration for George Lucas when he thought up the force in Star Wars. Obi-Wan was indeed right when he said that the force or consciousness is, to quote him, an energy field created by all living things. It surrounds us and penetrates us. It binds the galaxy together. End quote. This all aligns with the panpsychist idea that even the smallest elements of nature have their own subjective point of view, no matter how faint. But also, in the Hindu tradition of Advaita Vedanta, the highest truth is Brahman, infinite consciousness, eternal and without division. Every tree, every animal, every rock, every star, all of it is Brahman in disguise. Or as Alan Watts likes to describe it, God playing hide and seek with himself. And our individual selves, our Atman, are not separate either. They are Brahman localized, like a wave rising and falling in the ocean. The goal of spiritual practice is to pierce the illusion of separateness, that veil of Maya, and to awaken to the truth that consciousness is not inside us alone, but is the very essence of reality itself. Panpsychism echoes this when it claims that even the smallest particle may have some spark of felt experience. It is, in its own way, saying what Vedanta thought all along, which is that the world is alive with awareness. But also, Buddhist philosophy takes this in a slightly different but contemporary direction. The Buddha did not speak of a permanent self or an eternal Brahman. Instead, he taught emptiness and interdependence, that everything arises together in a great web of causes and conditions. Consciousness, too, is not a thing, but a process, flickering, impermanent, always dependent on the body, the world, and relationships. Yet, Buddhism still sees sentience everywhere, not just in humans, but in animals, insects, and perhaps even in more subtle forms of life that our limited minds can't perceive. Panpsychism bridges these three Eastern traditions by asking what if consciousness is neither an illusion nor a rare exception, but the fundamental currency of the universe. Taoism sees consciousness as a fundamental energy that pervades all reality. Vedanta leans toward a vision of a single cosmic consciousness, and Buddhism emphasizes the interdependent flicker of awareness in all living beings. Panpsychism gives us a philosophical framework to take all three positions quite seriously. And if this is true, the ethical implications are enormous. It means we cannot treat the world as dead matter, a resource to simply exploit. But the whole world suddenly becomes enchanted and brimming with vibrancy and life. Every being is in some way a center of experience, no matter how faint. And this provides a powerful case for environmental and animal ethics, with startling, almost terrifying consequences. If almost everything is awake and alive, that means almost everything has the capacity to suffer, no matter how minuscule that suffering may be. This is why it ought to be our aim to try and eliminate as much suffering and as much delusions of separateness as possible by going vegan or cutting down on carbon emissions or doing what you can to promote a more harmonious relationship with nature. Imagine how differently we might live if we treated rivers, forests, and animals not as objects but as fellow participants in consciousness. That compassion wasn't reserved just for humans, but was extended outward to all expressions of awareness. However, this is a rather pessimistic and guilt infused view of consciousness, but it doesn't have to be. Philip Goff, in his newest book, Why? The Purpose of the Universe, Philip Goff introduces one of my new favorite ideas ever, called cosmic purposivism. He argues that the purpose of the universe might actually be oriented towards value and the flourishing of conscious experience. In Goff's view, consciousness is what gives reality meaning and value, because consciousness is the only way in which we can actually experience meaning and value itself. Quite literally, without consciousness, nothing would matter. The cosmos isn't planning or plotting, in a typical human sense. There's no external desire that creates consciously like Yahweh with some great designer plan. But the unfolding of stars, planets, life, and mind can be seen as part of a natural process that favors the emergence and enrichment of experience. Evolution is designed in a way in which life becomes vastly more complex and harmonious in its functions. Look at how humans evolved from primitive, instinctual cavemen to rational and creative masterminds today. Your joy, your awe, your acts of love and creativity are not trivial, but are a part of the universe expressing itself consciously in new and unique ways. Cosmic propositivism reframes existence as an ongoing process of consciousness, realizing its ultimate potential in nature and in you yourself. And if consciousness is what gives reality value, then the flourishing of conscious experience is inherently and intrinsically good because purposiveness is built into the very nature of reality itself. This isn't mystical in a supernatural sense, but it is a philosophical naturalism that recognizes the universe as fundamentally experiential. Life is no longer lived for one's personal interest or their career or family for the cosmic propositivist, but ultimately served for the served for the advancement of the good purposes of ultimate reality through deepening the capacity for all beings to experience reality in its deepest essence in new complexifying forms. To quote Goff, true ethics is a concern to make reality better. End quote. And this is a quest anyone can embark upon, which will infuse one's life with meaning and not just purpose, but cosmic purpose. In this sense, panpsychism isn't only a metaphysically philosophical position, it's also a spiritual practice. It asks us to soften our boundaries, to expand our empathy, to loosen our grip of the ego, and to live as if the universe itself were awake. Because maybe, just maybe, it is. Well, that's all for this week of the podcast. I hope it proved enlightening or inspiring for you. And I would love to hear your thoughts or critiques of panpsychism in the comments below. Did this resonate with you, or did you think it was just a bunch of woo woo hippie nonsense? I'd love to hear your perspective regardless. And I hope you'll join me next week as we continue our exploration of consciousness, but view it from a more Western approach as we dive into the topic of Christ consciousness. In the meantime, I wish you all joy, peace, purpose, and wisdom. Peace.